Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zubin, let me ask you this. When Congress was considering whether to oppose the nuclear deal with Iran, we heard various statements from administration officials that Iran's non-nuclear behavior, which is, of course, support for terrorists, human rights violations, advancing their ballistic missile program, that those things would be outside of the scope of the deal. Yet, since implementation day, we've heard a different message. No new sanctions. We've heard that from the administration. No new sanctions, even if they are outside the scope of the deal. So can you clarify the administration's position? Because I thought that we were told that in their support, Iran's support for terrorism, that we could slap additional sanctions on it and it would not violate the JCPOA. If Iran had launched missiles, ballistic missiles, and we wanted to penalize them, that would not butt heads with the JCPOA. But now we hear differently. So would the administration veto new non-nuclear sanctions against Iran if the new sanctions are not intended to relist delisted entities?
Thank you, Ranking Member Engel.
And I'm sorry. Let me also say, when you're giving the answer, would the imposition of non-nuclear sanctions violate our obligations under the JCPOA?
I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the administration's views on this, and I would also offer Ambassador Mull, if he wants to come in when I conclude,
certainly,
to provide his view from the State Department. Our view has not been no new sanctions since implementation day, and in fact, to the contrary, you've seen the administration announce multiple rounds of new sanctions designations in exactly the areas you're talking about. Iran's support for terrorism, their ballistic missile program, Hezbollah, Mahan Air. We have been continuing on our path to knock out the key proxies that these companies are using to procure materials and to move money. So we've been very consistent on that from exactly, as you said, our statements announcing the deal and on throughout, including less than 2 months ago, new designations of the Quds Force affiliated airline Mahan Air, and new designations against the liquid propellant missile companies within Iran that work under SHIG, the Shahid Hamad Industrial Group. With respect to new legislation, I think the administration's view consistently has been there is no inconsistency with the JCPOA if it is outside the nuclear space, so long as it doesn't undermine or interfere with our commitments to fulfill what we committed to fulfill in the deal. Then the question becomes very much what specific legislation looks at and what are the details.
Well, because I think that while the President has the authority under existing law to sanction Iran, and the President has, which I support, I think it's not so terrible to have Congress come up with new sanctions if we feel Iran is violating its agreements. Certainly, in the launching of the ballistic missiles, the Chairman spoke about that with death to Israel on it. To me, that's a provocation. And when they continue to support terrorists, that's a provocation. And I think that sometimes it's important for the Congress to speak out on these things. You know, we've been having a lot of hearings on Iran and the implementation of JCPOA, and some of our previous hearings, some of our witnesses have said, well, if the Congress were to come out with new sanctions, it would just give it that little extra edge. It would really send a message to Iran that we are aware of what they're doing and we're not tolerating it. It's true that the President could implement and has the authority to implement new sanctions without the Congress acting, but I really think it's important that the Congress act. So I would just hope that the administration would seem to lessen its objection to Congress coming forward with with new sanctions, because after all, when the JCPOA was put in front of the Congress, we were told specifically that it would not affect further sanctions against Iran for things other than their nuclear program, which would be terrorism and ballistic missiles and some other stuff.
Yeah, and that continues to be our view. I do want to point out, though, that Congress's sanctions contribution continues to be very potent right now. And I neglected to mention this, so I'm glad I have the opportunity. When we announce new designations in the terrorism, human rights, ballistic missile, Syria, Yemen space that have to do with Iranian actors, thanks to Congress and thanks to your efforts, those sanctions do not just touch U.S. actors. Those sanctions have secondary or extraterritorial effects around the world, which means that if a financial institution in East Asia, in Africa, in Europe, or the Gulf engages in transactions with any of the IRGC, the missile actors, the human rights designated actors, thanks to Congress, they face these secondary sanctions, namely a cutoff, a potential cutoff from the U.S. financial system. Those are sort of, if you will, supercharged sanctions, and that's only thanks to Congress's efforts. And so those stand behind every designation that we issue, even since implementation day.
Well, that's a good point, and that's why the chairman and I both feel so strongly that Congress needs to continue to be involved, and that if we need to issue further sanctions, it does not violate our obligation under the JCPOA to do so. I'm just wondering quickly if Ambassador Mull has anything to add to it.
No, thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. Acting Undersecretary Zubin stated very clearly and succinctly that new sanctions on Iran's behavior outside the scope of the nuclear agreement would not be a violation of the JCPOA. We've been very clear about that publicly, as well as directly with our Iranian counterparts when they try to make that argument. We've been very clear throughout the negotiations, and as recently as my last meeting with the Iranians last week, that sanctions on such things as missile launches, which are inconsistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2231, weapons proliferation, destabilization, support for terrorism, will continue to have consequences from the United States government. There's no doubt about that in the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go to Mr. Chris